My family and I moved out of our apartment a few days ago, and we've been staying at the Renaissance Hotel all weekend. I was delighted when we checked in Friday night and discovered that our room has a beautiful view of this church and the sign outside announcing my sermon today. I think God must have a wonderful sense of humor, because I always said I wouldn't leave LA until I'd seen my name on a marquee in the middle of Hollywood. God's telling me I can go now in peace. Actually, my journey here today from a life in movies to a life in ministry has been a journey of obedience. In our scripture reading today, we heard the famous story of Abraham, who exemplified perfect obedience in his willingness to sacrifice his own son at the request of God. I know that many of us find this story disturbing, incongruous with our understanding of God. What kind of a loving God would ask a man to kill his own son, even as a test? We know that human sacrifice wasn't entirely uncommon among the ancients, but it's still a hard idea to wrap our heads around. It's hard because we live in a world where people commit heinous, violent acts against each other every day in the name of God, at the alleged request of God. I'm leaving my beloved, inclusive church today and moving to Belfast, a city famous for these very kinds of atrocities. Believe me when I tell you I've struggled with obedience. I've been struggling for months. And all I can offer you today are a few things I think I've learned in this process. I've learned that if we want to be obedient, we have to listen for God's voice. This passage says God spoke directly to Abraham. Now, whenever I read things like this, especially in the Old Testament, a small part of me still thinks of God as a giant floating head spouting orders from a cloud of fire. I think that's probably a little true for many of us. And the cartoon-like nature of that image makes it easy to dismiss the idea that God ever speaks to us at all. But I think we have to be careful here, or we're likely to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I generally experience God's presence in more indirect ways, in the line of a book, the touch of a friend, a meaningful coincidence, but there have been a handful of times in my life when I believe God spoke to me and gave me instruction. Not with trumpets of fire or outlandish pathological requests, but in quiet, insistent, gentle whispers to the deepest parts of my soul. And those instructions have always startled me. Join this church. Help the homeless. Go to Belfast. I've learned that if we want to hear God's voice and know God's will for our lives, we must be consistently present to God, still and quiet and present. Each time Abraham is spoken to in the story, his reply is the same. Here I am. It sounds simple, but it isn't, not for many of us. The wheels of our minds spin constantly, replaying the past, thinking about the future, worried about the next day, the next minute, the next hour. We spend so much time living in the past and the future that we miss the present, this moment, entirely. We humans have a peculiar inability to be where we are. Sometimes we lose minutes this way. Sometimes we lose chunks. Sometimes we lose chunks of days. And some people, God bless them, wake up and find their whole lives have been spent this way. Our thoughts are like frisky puppies that need to be housebroken. We must constantly, consistently, lovingly pick them up and put them back on the paper again and again, until we learn to be still. For it is in that stillness, that present silence, we hone through the conscious practices of prayer and meditation, that we begin to discern God's voice. I've learned that dwelling in the stillness long enough will eventually force us to confront our own shadows. It's there in that quiet space that we develop awareness of our own complicated minds, the places where our light These are prejudices, fears, judgments, limitations. Parker Palmer, the great Quaker author and teacher, said, "An inevitable but often ignored dimension of the quest for wholeness is that we must embrace what we dislike or find shameful about ourselves, as well as what we are confident and proud of. Darkness is not the whole of the story, but it is a part of the story most often left untold." Jesus commanded us to love our enemies. In my own life, I've found that my enemy is just as likely to be some aspect of myself. A habit, a thought, a fear I don't wish to face, but will never truly let me alone, not until I acknowledge it and own it and move through it. I've learned that owning my shadow ultimately brings me closer to God and helps me to be obedient, because until I own my shadow, I can never really own my light. I've learned that obedience is taking action even when my shadow exists. I've learned that obedience is a product, but it's also a process. A process that has less to do with blind faith and brute willpower, and more to do with willingness. Willingness to let go of our plans. Willingness to ask for willingness until we receive it. I've learned that inside the stillness, underneath the clamoring voices and fears and shadows, we come to know that God lives and speaks and infuses everything, even and especially the dark places. We come to know this in a vibrant, visceral way, the way Jesus intended us to know God. I've learned that obedience is more than an idea, more than a recommendation in a Bible story. It's the raw material from which miracles and great lives and remarkable feats are made. I've learned that obedience to God is not about committing the unthinkable or ignoring our powers of intellect and reason, but about trust. A trust that is so deep and so still, it infuses our lives with power and energy. And I've come to understand the story of Abraham as a wonderful metaphor. A metaphor for all the scary, messy, difficult places our lives will sometimes take us, and about our willingness to let go and let God create a masterpiece. Bear with me. John Lennon said, "Life is what happens when you're making other plans." I'd like to amend that, if I may. I think God is what happens when we're making other plans. God will not ask us to do the impossible. God will only ask us to do what we think is impossible. And I suspect Abraham knew that. I suspect he knew that before he ever took the first step of that journey. You see, true obedience is not about being righteous. It's about being willing. And when that's too hard, it's about being willing to be willing. I feel a lot like Abraham today. I feel like I'm being tested and called to do something that scares me, called to cut ties with the church and the community I love for a life and a future I can't yet see. Abraham had a hard time believing that he and his wife Sarah would ever conceive Isaac. He was their miracle baby. And as corny as this sounds, I feel the exact same way. You are my miracle church. I left the church years ago and vowed never to return. I had no use for God, for you, anything he had to offer. And then I stumbled into this place, Hollywood,